From the very first video in the History Traveler series, we established that we like cemeteries. Cemeteries are places that connect us with history, connect us with the past, no matter how big or small they might be. And today, we happen to be in a big one. This is Arlington National Cemetery. This was originally a cemetery that was established in the Civil War. It belonged to Robert E. Lee by way of his wife's family, and then whenever the Civil War broke out, the federal government just took it and used it to start burying the dead. And now it is the largest, I guess you could say the most prestigious of the national cemeteries. Lots of interesting people that are buried here. So we're going to go around, we're going to look at some of the more prominent graves. We're not even going to scratch the surface and hitting all of them, but we're going to hit a few. Now, most people know that John F. Kennedy is buried here at Arlington, but there is another president, and that is William Howard Taft is buried here at Arlington. President of the United States right after Theodore Roosevelt and right before Woodrow Wilson. Kind of a tragic president. He really didn't even want to be president at all. His wife wanted him to be president. Roosevelt wanted him to be president, and he didn't really do. He was just pretty unhappy as a chief executive. What he really had a passion for, and what his ultimate goal was to be a Supreme Court justice, which he achieved. He's the only man, at least to my knowledge, that served as both President of the United States and as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Pretty cool. This is kind of a cheap shot, but Taft is also known for being the only president to get stuck in the White House bathtub. He was a, shall we say, portly fellow. And look here, there's the grave of Thurgood Marshall. Marshall was one of the lawyers that argued in the Brown versus Board of Education case, a very famous Supreme Court decision, and was also the very first African American to serve on the Supreme Court. And this is his grave. Very interesting. Now, somebody left a baseball at this grave. That might seem a little bit odd until you see that it's the grave of Abner Doubleday, who is said to be the founder of baseball. And he's right here at Arlington. Here are a couple of interesting ones. In the early days of the Apollo space program, which was the name of the mission to send a man to the moon, there was a tragic fire on Apollo 1. And in that fire were 3 astronauts. One of them was Virgil Gus Grissom. There was another guy named Ed White, who is not buried here, and also Roger Chaffee. So you can learn more about that by just looking up Apollo 1 fire. A lot of horrible mistakes, and ended up costing these 3 guys their life. At the end of the Eisenhower administration, there was this huge international incident where one of our U-2 spy planes was shot down over the Soviet Union. And the guy who was the pilot of that U-2 spy plane was Francis Gary Powers, and he's buried right here at Arlington. If you ever watch the movie Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks, it's all about that crisis. Very interesting. Well, I wish that I could show you the Arlington House where Robert E. Lee once lived, but as you can see, it's a little bit out of order. That's too bad. Well, we can't get into the Arlington House, but I can tell a pretty interesting story about it. After the Civil War, well after it, I think maybe 10-20 years, I don't remember the exact date, but Robert E. Lee's oldest son, whose name was George Washington Custis Lee, took the U.S. government to court because he said that the property of his family had been illegally obtained. Ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court in Lee versus the United States, and he actually won. And Supreme Court ruled that the property had been obtained without due process, and the U.S. government had to give it back to the Lee family. So Arlington went back to the Lees, and then the son ended up selling it back to the U.S. government for, I think, like $150,000, which was a lot of money at the time. I think it translates to about $4 million today. But pretty interesting story. Oh, had to do some walking to find this one. David Hackworth, Colonel of the U.S. Army. If I remember right, he was at the tail end of World War II in the Merchant Marines, but definitely served in Korea and Vietnam. And as you can see, highly decorated. Distinguished Service Cross with 1 oak leaf cluster, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, 7 oak leaf clusters, Purple Heart with 7 oak leaf clusters. It's insane. He also wrote the book About Face and ended up getting kind of ostracized from the Army for his criticism on how the Vietnam War was being handled. He was trying to help, but his help was not appreciated. Anyway, there's the grave of David Hackworth. So in February of 1898, a ship called the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in Cuba and was kind of the powder keg that ignited the Spanish-American War. The press blamed it on a Spanish mine. Turns out it was probably something else, maybe a boiler room explosion. But anyway, this is the mast of the USS Maine that was recovered. I had no idea that this was here at Arlington. Very cool. I just walked around and discovered that not only do they have the mast of the Maine, but they also have the bell that was on the ship. Except for they cut it in half and hung it on this door. But there it is. I just heard these two speaking Spanish, so if you happen to be from Spain, sorry about that war. Look at this. No big memorial, no fanfare, no statue, nothing but an ordinary tombstone amongst all of the others for John J. Pershing, who led the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. Also a Missouri native. I really appreciate that here's one of the greatest generals in U.S. military history, and he's just right here. Simple headstone, just like all the others. Getting ready to go up to the gravesite of JFK and Bobby Kennedy. Kind of considered a solemn place, so I'm going to just let the images speak for themselves and refrain from doing any commentary up there. But I've been there before, and it's pretty unique place. Alright, so that was the graves of the Kennedy brothers. Pretty tragic story, what happened with that family. Now, the eternal flame, kind of an interesting story behind that. this is not the only place, nor is it the first place, where there has been an eternal flame. The original is in Paris underneath the Arc de Triomphe at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And the story, as I understand it, is that Jackie Kennedy saw it and remembered it and was so moved by it that she wanted one over the grave of her husband. Pretty neat story. Well, I just completely stumbled on this one. But here are the remains of the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger that exploded 28th of January 1986. It's one of my early memories. I remember that happening. Wow. And here are the remains of Dick Scobie, who was the commander of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Very interesting. Alright, well, that is just a few of some of the well-known figures that are buried here at Arlington. But we didn't even scratch the surface. I'm getting ready to go up here to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and then after that, we're going to look around at some of the famous individuals from World War II that are buried here at Arlington. But that is going to be in the next video. Well, early on in the History Traveler series, really from the very first video, we established that we like cemeteries, but we don't like it when it's too dark.